I mean, again, just to go back to the Iran war, we had to quit after 40 days because we were basically running out of weaponry. It's truly amazing the extent to which we have run down our inventories of like Tomahawk missiles, Patriot missiles, THAAD missiles, air-to-ground smart bombs, and so forth and so on. Really quite amazing. And it's also quite amazing how long it's going to take us to rebuild those inventories, which have been whittled down. And what this tells you is that we are going to have to prioritize. If you're going to plan for a war in Asia, right, and you're thinking about how you deal with the Chinese in a war over Taiwan or the South China Sea, a war that's going to go on for many months. Now, let's hope this never happens.
Welcome back. We're joined again by Professor John Mearsheimer to discuss what's happening in Ukraine, Iran, and of course, U.S. grand strategy in an increasingly confusing time. So thank you for coming back on, John. It's great to see you again.
You're welcome, Glenn. I'm glad to be back.
So I initially had intended a different topic, but as we see the bombing of Kiev last night, which according to the mayor, Klitschko, he argued this was the worst bombing of Kiev in the entire war. It begs the question, what does this mean? And also I've seen in other parts of the country, airfields being bombed, of military airfields, which again begs the question, why wait 4.5 years to go after these airfields? How are you assessing what the Russians are doing now?
Well, if you listen to a lot of the chatter surrounding this massive attack last night, it's seen as a reprisal for all of these drone attacks, these Ukrainian drone attacks into Russia. And the argument is that the Russians are getting tough now. When you hear that, and before you read about what the attacks looked like, you might think that what the Russians were going to do is go out and pound the civilian population, launch what might be called a classic punishment campaign. But it seems quite clear that that's not the case, that the Russians went after military, industrial targets, and they did not purposely attack civilians. According to the Kyiv Independent, 20 Ukrainians were killed. This is surely regrettable, but it's not a large number, and it does not represent a punishment campaign, a campaign designed to kill civilians. And what the Russians did was they launched a massive attack against, let's call them strategic targets. And they've done this in the past. There's not really that much new here. Yes, it was a massive attack, but as we know, there have been numerous occasions in the past where you've had massive attacks against military industrial targets. So I don't see how this could possibly represent a response to the drone attacks by the Ukrainians against the Russian heartland. It doesn't sort of add up to me. I think the Russians are probably going to spin it that way for public relations purposes to convince their Russian leaders will want to convince the domestic audience that they're responding to these drone attacks. But in reality, this is just what you would expect from the Russians and what we've seen from the Russians in terms of bombing campaigns. So that'd be my basic assessment of what's going on here.
Yeah, no, I know the media reports point to the larger killing of civilians, but as you said, in the past you would have like hundreds of drones and missiles, and you may have one or two deaths. This time it was relatively many more. But that being said, as you said, if you launch 500 missiles and drones, if the intention is to kill civilians, you're doing a very poor job. So it doesn't appear, as you said, this was a aim to target civilians. Again, doesn't mean that 20 deaths isn't horrible, but again, I think the context is important.
So that is, I think, at the moment, the most likely scenario for where you get a situation where Russia actually attacks a European, or to put it in more specific terms, a NATO member state. And I think for that reason, none of the Baltic states are willing to allow Ukraine to actually launch drones from their territory. But if that happens, I believe the Russians would axiomatically respond. They would be foolish not to. But let's assume that that's not going to happen. Then the question is, are the Russians going to retaliate at some point against Europe, given Europe's and America's assistance to the Ukrainians? Is it time for Russia to sort of throw down the gauntlet and actually attack targets in Eastern Europe? And this, of course, is the Sergei Karaganov argument, that the time has come to do that. And what we have to do, we meaning the Russians here, is we have to attack with conventional weapons first. And if that doesn't get the Europeans and the Americans to stop helping with this drone war, then we have to turn to the nuclear weapons. My view on this, Glenn, and I'd be curious what you think, is that the Russians won't do that right away. And I think there are sort of two reasons for that. One is, I think they believe that they can parry those drone attacks quite well. Now, that's not to say they'll be able to do that over the long term, because again, the G7 countries said they were going to accelerate their efforts to help Ukraine with this drone campaign. So it may reach the point where the Russians have no choice but to retaliate. But at this point, it looks like the Russians are doing a reasonably good job of parrying the attacks. And as long as that's the case, I think the incentives for the Russians to attack into Europe are reduced significantly. The other thing that I think really matters here is what happens on the battlefield. If you believe this rhetoric in the West that the Russians are stymied on the battlefield, and if anything, they're losing on the battlefield and they're suffering massive casualties, then you can spin out a story where it might make really good sense to pursue the Karaganov policy. But the fact is, that's not what's happening on the battlefield. The Russians are actually doing quite well. They're not winning a quick victory. There's no question about that. This is a steamroller that's moving quite slowly. But nevertheless, the Russians are moving toward conquering all of Donbass. They don't have much left to conquer before they control all of that real estate. So given that the Russians are doing quite well on the battlefield, and given the fact that the Russians seem adept at parrying these drone attacks quite effectively, not perfectly, but quite effectively for the moment, I think the incentives for the Russians to go down the Karaganov road are not that great at the moment. But who knows how this is going to play itself out in the months ahead. So that's kind of how I see it. And I'd be curious to know what you think of my analysis.
No, I think that probably sounds correct. I mean, that's why I also have been a bit cautious about the way, or worried about the way many Western leaders talk about the need to bring war to Russia or increase the pain on Russia, because I think the main reason why Russia's been able to be restrained by not retaliating directly against any NATO country is exactly because the pain has been within the limit of being able to be absorbed and without, having significant impact. So essentially being these pinpricks. So then they essentially say, well, instead of going after the puppet masters within NATO, we'll just take and we'll destroy and defeat their proxy. And I think this has been the main approach by the Kremlin. The problem, which is why I'm very worried when the European leaders, now seemingly the Americans as well, are setting the objective of increasing the pain on Russia, is that luxury of simply absorbing the pain goes away. And then there's more pressure of doing some direct strikes and risking a major war with the West. And again, it's speculation, but this would make sense, because what else can Russia do then if it's no longer sustainable? The attacks was assisted by the West. What are they going to do? Are they going to stop the war, accept a ceasefire where the West begins to rearm Ukraine in preparation of another war? I mean, are they going to leave Ukraine and have NATO march in thereafter? This is all capitulation, which would be an existential threat. So if there is no peace and the Western escalations aren't sustainable anymore, that is, they can't absorb the pain, then I think they will, from their perspective, they would have to strike Germany or the Baltic states, essentially putting the world at a new Cuban Missile Crisis. That is, either we go all out in war or you guys back off. And I think this is often what would be required, because often you see in human history, we do go all the way to the edge. And then once we face disaster, that's when state leaders begin to change their minds.
The New York Times had this piece on the relative balance of casualties. Casualties meaning killed in action plus wounded. And then they also had numbers of soldiers killed on both sides. And apparently the New York Times article was based on a study that had been done by a think tank in Washington, D.C., the CSIS. And the argument was that roughly around 450,000 Russians had died, and somewhere between 125 and 150,000 Ukrainians had died. So let's take the high-end number for the Ukrainians, which is 150,000. And again, the Russian number is 450,000. That's a 3-to-1 ratio. That means that 3 Russians have died for every Ukrainian. This is simply unbelievable. This cannot be the case. I don't understand where these numbers come from. First of all, the main killer on the battlefield is artillery. And throughout most of the war, the estimates are that the Russians have had at least a 5-to-1, if not a 7-to-1 or 10-to-1 advantage in artillery. If you look at these bombs, these smart bombs that are dropped from the air, the Russians have a huge inventory of smart bombs that they've been dropping on the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have virtually no smart bombs that they've been dropping on the Russians. You might say to yourself, well, it's the Russians who have mainly been on the offensive. Well, there's 2 problems there. One is that the Ukrainians have launched a large number of offensives. Remember the Kursk offensive? Remember the famous June 4th, 2023 offensive, the one that was going to result in a blitzkrieg that took the Ukrainians to the Sea of Azov and cut the Russian front lines in half? In 2022, the first year of the war, the Russians suffered 2 defeats because the Ukrainians launched major offensives in Kherson and Kharkiv. And then we hear about all these Ukrainian counterattacks these days. Those are offensive operations. So the Ukrainians have been on the offensive for a good part of the war, and therefore you can't make the argument that they've been on the defensive, and because the defense suffers less casualties than the offense does in almost all cases, we should not be surprised by that number that the New York Times uses. So you can't justify those numbers that way. It just makes no sense at all. And I think, if anything, that we're going to find out that the Ukrainians lost probably around, or have lost probably and here when I say lost, I mean killed in action, around 1 million men. I think the argument that they've lost 150,000 is ludicrous. It just makes no sense at all. And nevertheless, this is reported as fact, and it is a set of facts. What I'm describing here is a set of facts that all sorts of people use to assess what the situation is between Russia and Ukraine and what we should do moving forward. And if you believe these numbers, which again, I think are ridiculous, you can justify upping the ante and trying to help Ukraine really clobber the Russians and knock the Russians off as a great power, finish them off as a great power. And lots of people talk that way. And you just sort of say to yourself, are they making all of this up? Are they making these numbers up? Do you think the New York Times is making these numbers up? I don't think they're making them up. I think they really believe them. Again, there may be all sorts of motivated biases at play here that they are not aware of.
How do you measure success in the war against Iran on behalf of the Americans, that is? How would you measure progress? Because it's a very unique kind of war. Is it the destruction of ballistic missiles, offensive capabilities, defensive capabilities? Is it removing proxies or allies, be it Lebanon, Iraq, or Yemen? How would we know if the United States would be winning the war against Iran?
A couple of points. One is we're not going to win the war. We're going to lose the war. But in the process of losing the war, we have two goals that we need to achieve. And if we come out of this in reasonably good shape, we will have achieved those two goals. But it is very important to understand that Iran has won this war. Iran is going to emerge from this war much more powerful relative to its neighbors than it was on February 27th. America's position in the Gulf is going to be greatly weakened as a result of this war. But I want to get to your specific question because it is terribly important. We have two goals here. Putting aside the question whether we win or lose, we have two goals. Number one is to open the strait because we got to get oil flowing. And that will include Iranian oil, which we're allowing to come out of the strait. And we're allowing the Iranians to get paid in dollars for that oil, right? We're giving them a good deal because we want to flood the market with oil so that the international economy doesn't go off a cliff. So goal number one was to open the strait, get the oil flowing. Goal number two is to get a nuclear deal. We have to get a nuclear deal. It's obviously going to be some variant of the JCPOA, but there has to be some sort of deal that limits what Iran can do in terms of developing nuclear weapons moving forward. You mentioned missiles. There's going to be no agreement on missiles. Some people might say, well, what about supporting Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis? There's going to be no agreement there, right? The regime change, that was another one of our goals. There's not going to be regime change. Not as a immediate result of this war, maybe in 2 or 3 or 4 years, who knows, but not now. The key issue is the nuclear issue. Now, it's very important to understand how the Memorandum of Understanding was structured. It was structured so that the shooting or the bombing between Iran and the United States would be shut down once the memorandum was signed. And number two, the strait would be opened and oil would flow out into world markets. Now, with regard to the bombing campaign stopped on April 8th. There was really nothing to stop. The bombing campaign ended and we went to a blockade. And we can't go back to a bombing campaign for a whole slew of different reasons, right? So that really didn't matter that much, except maybe in Lebanon. but let's leave Lebanon aside. The key issue to start with that we cared about was opening the strait. And the strait is now opened for all intents and purposes. Not fully open, but it appears that it may be fully opened. And if it isn't, we're in real trouble. But that was the least difficult goal to achieve because the Iranians have a vested interest in selling their oil. Okay. The big number two goal that's sitting out there is the nuclear issue. And that is yet to be resolved. What you want to understand here is we now have to deal with the nuclear issue side by side with four big economic issues that would all be advantage Iran. One is reparations. Two is the frozen assets. Three is lifting the sanctions. And four is the question of the toll booth in the strait. In other words, these issues have not been resolved. Just think about it. That $300 billion fund for reparations, not settled yet. Lifting all the sanctions, not settled yet. Releasing all the frozen assets. I guess there are probably over $100 billion in frozen assets. Unfreezing all of them. And then the toll booth issue. Okay, they have to be resolved, those issues. And the nuclear issue has to be resolved, right? So we have solved the problem of opening the straits for the most part in the beginning. And now we have all those other big issues staring us in the face. And I would just say to you, if we don't get a deal, we meaning the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, we don't get a deal on the nuclear issue, we're going to be in real trouble because, as you well know, the Iranians have the capability to quite easily build a bomb. And if we don't have something like a revised version of the JCPOA, what's going to stop them from building a bomb?
Let me just ask one final question, though. If we take a few steps backwards to see a larger picture, how would you define the American grand strategy now at this point in history? That is, during the Cold War, the grand strategy with, one rival, one other center of power with one competing ideology. It was, the grand strategy of containment and all the other components. It set a clear goal, which kind of brought more or less the whole political class together. All other strategies were kind of had to be subordinated to this wider grand strategy. What is it today? Well, how is the United States dealing with the massive changes in the world and its own role in this world?
Along comes the Trump administration, back into the White House, January 2025. What you see is that President Trump decides to make the Western Hemisphere a high priority, and we're deeply involved in social engineering and military engagement in the Western Hemisphere. If you look at what's happening in Venezuela, if you look at what's happening with regard to Cuba, if you look at President Trump's rhetoric about the Panama Canal, about Greenland, and making Canada the 51st state, the United States is paying a lot of attention to the Western Hemisphere, which kind of befuddles me because I don't think we face any serious threats at this point in time in the Western Hemisphere. But nevertheless, we are deeply involved in doing social engineering and even maybe acquiring territory in the Western Hemisphere. You want to remember that President Trump said at the time when we captured President Maduro of Venezuela that the United States now, or he now runs Venezuela, and that he basically viewed Venezuelan oil as American oil. It's really quite remarkable. So you can see that we're on the march in certain ways in the Western Hemisphere. With regard to the Gulf, we're now involved in a major conflict with Iran. It's really quite amazing. One can make the argument, Glenn, that we will eventually leave the Gulf. that we can no longer maintain military bases there. Our alliance structure is in tatters. That may happen. But for the time being, if you look at American grand strategy, we are up to our eyeballs in alligators in the Persian Gulf. And as I said, we're deeply involved in the Western Hemisphere. With regard to Ukraine and Europe, as we talked about earlier in the show, it appears that President Trump is more or less re-engaging in Ukraine, getting more deeply involved. And one could argue, Glenn, as the tide turns against Ukraine, which you and I know is happening as we speak, that the Americans will feel compelled to move in and do everything possible to rescue Ukraine so as not to suffer a humiliating defeat. And then there's East Asia. That is what the Pentagon calls the pacing threat. So we're not leaving East Asia. And if you look at what the Chinese are likely to do over time and what the Americans are likely to do over time, that's a dangerous area of the world. I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years from now or even 5 years from now, when you and I are talking about all the problems in the world, that China is not at the top of the list. So all of this is to say that the United States, under President Trump, has a remarkably ambitious grand strategy. Think about what I said about the Western Hemisphere. Think about where we are in the Gulf. Think about where we are vis-a-vis Ukraine. And think about the pacing threat, China. We don't seem to believe in the word prioritizing. The United States still labors under the illusion that it can be everywhere and do everything all the time.
If you prioritize everything, you're not prioritizing anything at all. And but again, it could be, huge shifts in the international distribution of power. It's usually destabilizing because politicians, they do need time to adjust to new realities, I think. Anyways, do you have any final thoughts before we end the video?
Yeah, let me make 2 quick points. One is the debt problem.
I sorry to interrupt, but I always look at the debtclock.org and I'm not even American. It's still depressing to me. It's a horrific number. So yeah, sorry. Go on.
No, you're right. It's you sort of think the chickens are going to come home to roost on that problem at some point in time. Second thing is, Glenn, if you look at the Ukraine war, and you think about fighting a war against China, or you think about fighting a war anywhere, what's very clear is that you need a large industrial base and you need the capability to produce huge numbers of weapons. Again, just to go back to the Iran war, we had to quit after 40 days because we were basically running out of weaponry. It's truly amazing the extent to which we have run down our inventories of like Tomahawk missiles, Patriot missiles, THAAD missiles, air-to-ground smart bombs, and so forth and so on. Really quite amazing. And it's also quite amazing how long it's going to take us to rebuild those inventories, which have been whittled down. And what this tells you is that we are going to have to prioritize. If you're going to plan for a war in Asia, right, and you're thinking about how you deal with the Chinese in a war over Taiwan or the South China Sea, a war that's going to go on for many months. Now, let's hope this never happens. I'm not saying this is likely or it's going to happen, but the Americans are going to have to prepare for a long war. This is what the Ukraine war has taught us. And we don't have the manufacturing base. When you look at how long it's going to take us to replenish our depleted stocks from the Iran war, it's really genuinely frightening from a security point of view. Really, it's quite amazing. So I think when you look at the debt problem and you look at the weakness of the American manufacturing base and the need to build a large-scale inventory of weapons and to have the ability to produce weapons once the conflict starts, we have a lot of work cut out for us. And that's going to involve prioritizing. So I think that the events that are now taking place, me put it slightly differently. The events that have taken place since the Ukraine war started in 2022 up to the present day, this 5-year period is a period in which we have, or maybe it's a 4-year period, is a period in which we have learned a lot. And what we have learned should leave us deeply worried about our future. And when I say our, I'm talking here about the U.S.
Well, until next time, I hope to be able to discuss some more grand strategy with you because, the U.S. has a fascinating history there. So thank you so much for your time and have a good one.
My pleasure, Glenn. Best to you.
大家好，我是主播周玉琴。很多的朋友告诉我们，选择原版的太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，它添加有羽衣甘蓝，健康再加分。而有睡眠困扰的朋友们，赶快选择蓝色包装这一款晚安加强版，绝对是更有感。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good， 请上快点购为健康下单，而且要记得输入推荐代码，有额外的折扣优惠。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌基础版、晚安加强版新包装改版，内容不变，抽取更方便。要吃就吃最好的。